In 1348, a silent killer wiped out nearly half of Europe's population. But while the world was dying, a bizarre economic miracle happened. Suddenly, because there were no workers left, the poorest peasants became the most powerful people in society, completely destroying the centuries-old wealth system. This is how the Black Death broke the economy. The survivors looked around their empty villages and realized their new reality. The extreme loss of life had created an absolute vacuum in the workforce. This massive demographic collapse inverted the medieval hierarchy. The lowest class instantly acquired the leverage to dismantle a centuries-old wealth system from the bottom up. The catastrophic death toll forced a violent economic reset that the ruling class was powerless to stop. To understand the shock of 1348, look at the medieval economy beforehand. Land ownership was the absolute metric of wealth. If you controlled the acreage, you held the power. This chart shows the architecture of feudalism. The entire pyramid required an extreme oversupply of trapped, endlessly replaceable peasant labor to function. The brutal math of the era meant individual human life carried virtually zero economic value. Because peasant labor was infinite, the ruling class paid practically nothing for it. The system appeared mathematically unbreakable. The elites took their trapped workforce as a given, until an external biological shock wiped out the very resource they relied on. The plague swept across the continent with terrifying speed. In a matter of months, a 50% population wipeout emptied entire geographic regions. The physical landscape deteriorated immediately. Vast agricultural fields were left rotting. Crops died on the vine because there was no one left to harvest them. The elites suddenly faced an urgent economic breakdown. Their prized estates generated nothing. Without human hands to work the soil, the land sat entirely dormant. The Black Death forced a harsh mathematical reality onto the ruling class. Capital and land hold absolutely zero intrinsic value without the labor required to extract it. Standing in those rotting fields, the surviving peasants recognized their situation. They were the only ones who knew how to plow, and they were exceedingly scarce. The supply of labor drops off a cliff. However, the demand for food remains static and high. The peasants issue an unprecedented ultimatum, refusing to work for pennies. Consequently, the line representing their labor value violently skyrockets. Facing imminent starvation and total financial ruin, the elite class had no alternative. They were forced to pay these exorbitant new rates. By simply recognizing their mathematical leverage, the lowest class shattered the absolute authority of the elites. They broke the core mechanic of feudalism. The ruling class panicked. They faced a total loss of economic control, and the backlash was immediate. The government desperately attempted to cheat the new system. They drafted sweeping legislation intended to artificially freeze wages across the board. These laws contained strict mandates. They attempted to force survivors to work for pre-plague rates, backed by the threat of severe and violent punishment. The ruling class believed ink and parchment could override the market reality of a halved population. The peasants, fully aware of their new economic value, refused to comply. They sparked mass rebellions across the continent that the remaining knights and lords were too few to suppress. The government's wage laws failed. The elites permanently lost their absolute power over the peasantry, and the system of serfdom began to dissolve in the face of rising costs. The collapse of 1348 permanently raised the price of labor. By the time the plague receded, the old feudal contracts had vanished, replaced by a system where the survivors dictated their own value.